Okay, I believe I've got all of the audio tweaks that I needed to do. It is 9 o'clock, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We may have a couple trickling in. I know I've got messages from our special project team as well as our board of people trying to make it and being stuck in class and work. So we'll see if a few trickle in. Just as an introduction, we do have some new faces. Thank you for joining us. Really love seeing new faces, and I am going to send out a link really quickly in the chat. This is our link tree for KD Women in Business. This will give you all of our socials, our links, our Canvas page, things like that, so you can stay in touch and stay on top of events, both current, upcoming, getting to our YouTube recordings, because I am very excited. Especially it's been months in the making, and just so grateful to have Dr. Michelle Morkert here with us tonight. I don't want to take up too much of her time because her and Priyanka have been working very diligently to give us a wonderful session tonight. But just a couple of house announcements. Again, my name is Michelle Din. I'm our president right now, and that will be changing. So we will be having elections coming up. If anybody is interested in discussing any open VP roles or the presidency, we do have those coming up. So please reach out to me directly. Or if you are connected with one of our VPs already, please start and open that discussion so we can have those opportunities. If you're not ready for a VP position or the presidency, we also do have our special projects team. So that comes with a much smaller time commitment, because I know in Kelly, we are all just a little bit busy. So I really appreciate you taking your time tonight to join us. And with that, don't want to break into any more time tonight. I am going to hand it over to Priyanka Raha. She is our VP of Networking Events, and she has been able to coordinate tonight's session with Dr. Michelle Morkert, and we are just so grateful to have you here tonight. So I will hand over.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Michelle. By the way, so Michelle Morkert, are you sharing your screen, or should I share my screen? Just wanted to make sure.
Why don't you do it? I'd prefer that, just because I'm not sure. I don't know what the setup would be. So yeah, that's easier.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so yeah, before I just share my screen, I would like to give a brief introduction of who don't know Dr. Michelle Morkert. So as we celebrated International Women's Day last week, and this month, the month of March actually, we are celebrating Women's History Month. So there could not be any better opportunity to present Michelle Morkert, Dr. Michelle Morkert today, because she is a certified professional transformation coach for women leaders, specifically for women leaders. About Dr. Michelle's background, she consulted with the US State Department on women's leadership in Croatia and Poland. That's with the State Department, and also in academia, she developed and taught over 20 courses. She presented at dozens of academic and women's leadership conferences. And she was able to do all of these being a first-generation college student and while raising her 3 children. So that's amazing. So today she is going to talk about Beyond Imposter Syndrome, 3 secrets of trailblazing women leaders. And also I would like to give a shout out to our president, VP President Michelle Din, for introducing me to our guest speaker tonight, because it's without your help, today's event wouldn't have been possible. So a huge thank you to Michelle. Thank you. With that, I just need to open my PowerPoint. I'll open your PowerPoint. 1 second. Give me just a second, and then I can share my screen.
Take your time. And thank you for having me. Thank you, Michelle, for the invitation, and Priyanka for meeting with me ahead of time. I'm really happy to be here. And while we're getting the PowerPoint set too, the other thing I'll add is that yesterday was Pay Equality Day in the United States. It was so funny. I was on a podcast because this is like the month, where I'm doing all the things because people are thinking about women right now. And I'm like, and we can do this all the time, but this is the month where it's kind of tiring, right? And I was on a podcast with somebody who's based in Canada, and we were talking about this just briefly. I said, oh, it's Pay Equality Day. And so she gets on the podcast and she's like, so we have a really special day today. And I was like, well, we have a day. I mean, it's special because we can, think about pay equity, but yeah. So basically, for those of you who aren't familiar with that, yesterday was the day that we mark the time that it took beyond 2022 for women to earn what men earned in 2022. So we're about 2.5 months behind. And when it's really complicated, obviously, to talk about pay equity. We have to use an intersectional approach to think about, well, which men are we talking about and which women are we talking about, right? But I can just say, and how do people identify? But I can say generally, when we're talking about that dollar, we're primarily talking about white men earning that dollar, and then their colleagues, right? Their counterparts, the women, what they would be earning. So the average right now is 82 cents for every dollar. And in the 1980s, it was 80 cents. So in the 80s, it was 80 cents. And right now in 2023, it's 82. So we're at a 2 cents increase in 40 years. And I would also like to point out too, that white women make more. So primarily white women would make that 82 cents, whereas Native American women would earn 60 cents, Black women would earn 58 cents, and Latinas would earn 54 cents. So when we're thinking, and then we also have to think, okay, so then like African American men, how much are they making compared to that dollar? And Latinos, how much are they making compared to that dollar? So it is, kind of more complicated than saying 82 cents, but I think it's important to think about how long it's taken to get to 82 cents and to think about the action steps that we can take, because there are steps that we can take. So I'd be happy to talk about that at the end too, if anybody has any questions. So Priyanka, can you put it on the slideshow for me, please, so that we're
oh, okay.
Because it's not on the actual slideshow.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
Is it loading? Okay.
There we go. Yep, we've got it. All right. So the hope for us tonight was to be able to, spend a lot of time having conversation so that we can discuss your questions that you have. So tonight will be a night where we're going to talk about some disruptions to the narrative of imposter syndrome. That's why I talk about beyond imposter syndrome. And we're going to talk about some really clear strategies. And we're going to talk a lot about stories. And so that's where I would like to begin. And we don't have to advance quite yet. I want to start with some stories and even open it up if people want to jump in. You can raise your hand, or maybe I can see you because I can't see everybody here. But, Priyanka, you can help me as well if you see somebody want to jump in. But when we talk about imposter syndrome, a lot of people, have maybe a personal example in their minds, right, of what that imposter syndrome might feel like for you. So just very quickly, imposter syndrome can look like, and I'll give you examples from some of the people that I know. Desiree, for example, is a certified coach. Okay, she's been a certified coach for almost 3 years, and yet she's not opened her practice yet. She continues to get more certifications and more specializations and works a part-time job until she's ready, until she's finished all of her coursework. And then there's Jessica, who's a business owner, a successful business owner, who gets so nervous about negative feedback that she works with the clients that are not her clients, but she kind of like dives in, you know, to help them when they express some frustration with the tutor that they're working with, instead of letting the tutor and the person, you know, work it out together, right? She's just petrified that one negative comment is going to tank her business. And Whitney, for example, is the only female in her law firm. And they're on the Slack channel, you know, one day, and she calls out somebody, one of her male colleagues, and texts me the next morning because she hasn't been able to sleep all night because she's worried about what the backlash might be, or did she do the wrong thing, or how is she going to come across? Or the communications professor who's petrified of public speaking, so much so that, you know, she's doing push-ups in her office, her face is bright red, she's, you know, coming up with every possible solution to, you know, get out of doing it, right? The graduate student, and I can speak for myself here, who has, you know, a high GPA and gets 1 B, and that's the only thing they can think about is that 1 B and what they did wrong. Or you give a presentation and someone says, well done, and then the presenter says, well, you know, it was okay, I was kind of tired, right? And unable to accept the compliment. So these are all very common examples of imposter syndrome. And so tonight, I'm hoping we can get into some of your examples. I'll share more examples, and I'll share some of the key themes that I like to talk about in terms of imposter syndrome. So we can advance the slide to the next one, please. Thank you. So imposter syndrome is this idea of not having an internal sense of worth. Okay, so it's the idea that we don't belong. It's the research in the United States started in the late 1970s with Dr. Pauline Clance and Susan Imus, and they wrote about women, and that was their target audience from the very beginning. And after they started this work in the late 1970s, Dr. Valerie Young took it over in the 1980s, and she's the one who so many people are familiar with. And she started an institute for imposter syndrome. And more recently, though, Ruchika Tulshan and Jodi Ann Burry have been writing quite a bit about imposter syndrome. And this article here that I've referenced on the first slide is one of HBR's most widely read articles, and is part of an anthology that they put out not that long ago. But what I want to say about the work of Tulshan and Burry is that in their conversations, they encourage us to look at the systems and not just the individuals. Okay, so this is, you know, sometimes controversial when they say we really don't like to talk about imposter syndrome in women-only spaces. And a lot of people think, well, why not? Right? This is where we need to be having these conversations. And they say, you know, everyone experiences imposter syndrome, but who we pathologize are women, as if there's something else that now women need to overcome, right? That there is some other weakness that women have. And what Ruchika Tulshan and Jodi Ann Burry ask us to do is take a look at the context, because they say when we strip the conversation of context, that's when we move into pathologizing. Whereas what we really need to do is stop trying to fix women and take a look at what part of the system actually needs to be fixed. And I think that's very important. In fact, they say that healthy self-doubt is helpful, which I agree with. And so why is it that we think that women have more of a problem with this, right? And so when they say, well, let's take a look at the system, then it begins to make a lot of sense, because imposter syndrome is about feeling like you don't belong. It's that that worry, maybe some of you have had, that I was accepted into grad school on mistake. They meant to accept somebody else. It wasn't actually me, right? And it's so outlandish, but it feels real, right? We feel it in our core. And so because of that, we engage in a lot of other responses, such as perfectionism and overwork. And we're going to talk about all of that in just a minute. But their point is that telling women that they have imposter syndrome adds to the blame and the shame and that individualized sense of, well, what else am I doing wrong, right? What do I need to do better? Now I have to overcome this imposter syndrome. So they're asking us to take a look at the environmental issues. And so the first piece here is, of course, you feel awful. You feel awful because maybe you're the first. You're the first of a particular group. You're the first in a field. You are the first to try something that no one in your family has ever done before. You're a first generation. You're the first in an academic department, right, to have a certain background. So of course you feel uncomfortable because the systems weren't actually designed for us in mind. It doesn't mean that we don't belong there, but it means that we look around and we think, well, we haven't belonged here historically. And so that in and of itself creates a sense of concern. It creates a sense of worry. It creates a sense of fear. And Tolshan and Jodi Ann Burry and Aiko Bethia have written quite extensively about what needs to be done in the workplace. So Ruchika Tolshan just released a book in 2021, so this was 2 years ago now, about inclusion on purpose. She wrote another one in about 2016 about diversity in the workplace. And they've written another Harvard Business Review article about with actionable steps of what can happen in the workplace to make it feel more equitable, so that there's a responsibility on the institution itself to make changes so that it's not an individualized experience that we have, right? Because we need to start having these conversations and take a look at it and say, okay, there are patterns here. What needs to change in the workplace and how can we engage in this collectively? They also center women of color in their research, and historically it's been primarily white women who have been studied. And so the research continues to develop. But one of my, first points here is, of course, you feel awful. That's what happens when you're a trailblazer. That's what happens when you're a first. That's what happens when you're trying to shatter some glass ceilings. How many times you hit your head before there's a crack? That is the path for many of us. And so when we stop thinking that there's something wrong with us, that we need to be fixed, and we understand that it is part of the process, it helps a little bit, right? It helps us to stop thinking that it's something we need to avoid, and it becomes data for us to then engage with and say, oh, I understand this is a response to a system that's telling me that I need to do it this way, or the messaging that I got that says I have to work 5 times harder than somebody else to get half as far. Because when we engage, with those feelings that there's something wrong with us, and we start to believe that, then what do? Well, that's when we experience burnout, because we're trying to be perfect, and perfection doesn't exist, right? Which leads to overwork. So that means we're working much more than we need to, and we're becoming exhausted as a result of it. The doubt then continues to grow and grow, because you're never going to be perfect, and we're trying to avoid also feedback sometimes, right? Because it's that evidence that, oh my God, I'm not perfect, actually. I didn't do this very well. And they're going to find out that I don't actually belong here. So when we think about imposter syndrome and think, okay, so I understand that this awful, this feeling of fear is more universal than what I thought it was. And I'm trying to make a place where a place hasn't been made before. And I come from a long history of that. If we just look around at all people who've been trailblazers, who've, paved the way for us, many have experienced this imposter syndrome. And so, it helps us to disrupt the exhaustion that we might have. It helps us to measure our successes a little bit differently. It's a sign that we're beginning to take up space. And it's, a sign that we can stop overworking, stop chasing the extra credentials to try to earn, some place and some self-worth, because that's just not going to happen. And so imposter syndrome is, an issue for the system. And then it's something that we legitimately feel as individuals. And, we need to work on that. And so if you can move to the next slide, we're going to really start talking about some stories. And you're going to see these slides are a little surprising. I want to talk about the inner critic and the technique of reframing, renaming, and reclaiming it. And the inner critic is that voice that, says, don't do it. Don't stand up in that meeting. If you do, you better do it the right way. If you do it, someone's going to think something negative of you. You're going to ruffle some feathers. We don't have any, we don't have the qualifications, right? We don't have the experience. We need to wait a little while. The inner critic is simply an extension or manifestation of our safety instinct. That's what it is. It's there for a reason, and it has served us well over time. And yet sometimes it doesn't belong there, right? Sometimes it's overactive when it doesn't need to be. And so when we're in a situation, in an institution, especially in academia, that's, one very highly competitive space where I see so much imposter syndrome coming up, because we're, needing to write with authority, we're needing to publish, we're needing to teach, we're needing to get certain sorts of teaching evaluations, right? It's highly competitive. And so these are the kinds of spaces where we see a lot of imposter syndrome. So the imposter syndrome can keep us from taking action toward our goals. We procrastinate. We really oftentimes, when we're feeling imposter syndrome and that inner critic comes up, we start to believe that narrative. And what becomes important is that we reframe the role of the inner critic. So the inner critic is there to keep us safe, not there to hurt us. And when we think about that devil on our shoulder, some people call it that, it's really a lot of animosity within ourselves, right? We start to get really stressed out. We think we're not going to be able to handle our own self-criticism. That's why we get really worried most of the time. It's because we think we're not going to be able to handle what happens if we make a mistake. But everybody makes a mistake. So working with our imposter syndrome is helping us to understand the process of learning and the process of success and failure and how they go together. It helps us to expect the imposter syndrome or the inner critic to show up. So when we understand why it's there, that it's a natural function, then we don't have to fight against it. And then once we realize that it's there, then we need to start learning about what kind of messaging is there and how it connects to our limiting beliefs. Because I work primarily with women and people who identify as women who have limiting beliefs that were socially conditioned. We all have it, right? I mean, we can talk about gender and systems and the patriarchy as a power structure that is so often like the air we breathe and the water that we drink. And unless we smell something, right, unless it's lovely or horrible, we don't notice it. And so we are all operating within these gendered systems. And for many of us, we were conditioned to not, like I said earlier, not rock the boat. We're conditioned to be polite. We're conditioned to be palatable. We're conditioned to lead, but not lead too loudly. We're conditioned to be responsible for other people. We're conditioned to volunteer because it's some of that sacrificial work that actually is where we experience our validation. So in the workplace, we see women taking on a lot of emotional labor. And we think that, that is a way to make a path for ourselves. We want to help, we want to be involved, we want to be active. And sometimes those are the paths that we take, but yet they lead us to that exhaustion. And so the inner critic can say, well, you'd better do that because you want people to think you're a team player, or you'd better not say that at the meeting because people are going to think you're bossy. And we all know what those words are that we're afraid someone's going to call us. I was talking with a group just earlier this week, and someone told her that she was dominant. And I thought, oh, so how does that come across to you? And it wasn't positive, right? And so she wanted to lead, but she didn't want to be dominant. I'm like, okay, so we're just doing all sorts of mental gymnastics here to try to find a path, to try to find a way for ourselves. So when we understand why the inner critic is showing up, then we can begin to work with it. And I want you to just go with me on this little exercise. And there's a lot of data that proves the reason that this is a helpful exercise, and yet it seems quite silly. And it's the reason I have this picture of Thanos here. So I don't know how many of you are Avengers fans. I hope some of you know who this character is. So this is Thanos, who is the villain at the very end of the Avengers series. And Thanos is huge. I mean, a lot of them are, disproportionate and, but he's the biggest one, right? And he's the most dangerous one. And what Thanos wants to do is eliminate half of the world to start over and to then have a better life for the other 50%. And he's committed to this. He's been committed to this, and he has a reason for it. The reason that I've put Thanos up here is because one of my clients has named her inner critic Thanos. And I'll tell you why. So I ask my clients to think about the messaging that you get from your inner critic, because a lot of times it's a similar refrain. Sounds the same over and over again. Comes up in really specific kinds of circumstances. And sometimes it's harsh, or maybe it's more fearful, worrisome. I don't know what the sort of the tone of it is for you, but I'd love for you to think about it right now. If you can imagine a time that your inner critic has shown up, and maybe it was when you were about to do something that you've never done before, or you're about to take a risk, or you were gonna take an exam, you were gonna give a presentation, you're applying for grad school, applying for a job. I mean, there's so many examples, right, of when that critic would show up that many of us are familiar with. So think about that. And think about how you would describe that inner critic. What is the tone of it? Just think about it for a minute, and think about where you feel it in your body, because our nervous systems are very involved in this whole process with the inner critic. I mean, do we start to sweat? Do we feel like we're going to throw up? What happens? And then what would you call that voice? What is a name? There really aren't any rules, except that we don't want to call our inner critic the name of someone we know, right? So we don't want it to be like your mom or your father or your sister, right? Your brother. So it shouldn't be somebody that you know. And also it shouldn't be terribly evil either, because we don't want to have an adversarial relationship with it. So I'm going to come back to Thanos. So my client is a very small woman. Okay, so it was really interesting for her to think about Thanos as just this huge voice that dominates her when it comes up. And she also liked Thanos because Thanos had a reason for this decision, even though it was way off, right? There was still some sort of rationale behind it. And so she thought that, this was really fitting. And so I said, great, it's Thanos. And this is what we're going to call the inner critic. I've had clients give it names that just seem really silly. And when it's silly, that's actually quite helpful, because we know then that we're disrupting some of those neural pathways that have allowed it to be a very dominant voice, one that we tend to trust, and the one whose narrative we start to believe and have believed for a while. So one client and I were doing this exercise, and I said, so what do what would you name it? And she goes, Tiffany. I'm like, oh, okay. She's like, I don't know Tiffany. I'm like, great. we don't want to know a Tiffany. And I don't know why. She doesn't know why, but that's the name of it. And so it doesn't even really matter what the name is, just that it feels like it matches. And what happens then is we depersonalize it. We take it out of the driver's seat. It doesn't have as much power over us. And then we set it aside. And then we can begin to expect that voice to show up. In fact, when it does show up, we can think, oh, I was wondering when you were going to be here. Of course you're here. I'm doing something hard. Of course you're here. I'm doing something scary. Of course you're here. I'm nervous. I've never done this before. And you're here to help me stay in my lane, to keep quiet. So what that does is maybe protect us in some way, but it doesn't get us to our goal in the long run, right? We want to give that presentation. We want to get that degree. We want to start a business. So staying small isn't going to help us do any of that. When we remove it from us, then it has a lot less power. So then the third piece then is to reclaim it and say, all right, so you can sit in the back seat. You can come along with me. I'm not trying to banish you because it's impossible, but it doesn't work that way. The inner critic is there for a reason and it's going to stick around. But if we can begin to, work with it a little bit differently, and then we think about how that connects to these feelings of imposter syndrome, it can really make a difference in how we're feeling and how much power that imposter syndrome has over our decision-making process. So we'll go to the next slide. And this is my third point, which is choose courage. And I will tell you, this is my story. This is why this ice bath is here. A lot of us think that confidence is a feeling that we wait to experience before we take action. Okay, so I just don't have enough confidence to do this. I would give the presentation, but I just don't feel confident in myself. The thing is that confidence isn't going to be there right away when something is brand new because you don't have the competence yet. You haven't developed the skill to do it yet. But what gets us to confidence is taking the courageous action. And so that's where imposter syndrome comes in and puts a stop oftentimes to our progress because we're so worried, that we're going to make a fool out of ourselves. If we publish that article, they're going to finally know that we don't belong here, that we really don't know what we're talking about. Even if I publish 10, this is going to be the one, right? Or sometimes I'll work with people, and I can speak from my own experience on this as well, that the more accomplishments that they have, right? The more degrees they have, the more publications they have, the harder it is to continue because then the stakes are so high. I can remember saying that myself. Oh, well, I've done so well, I'm going to mess up really soon. And so that, struck such fear in me that then I was feeling fearful, and I still did it, right? And I still did well, but I had this narrative in my head that, well, then it's gonna be the next time, and it's gonna be the next time, and the next time. And so when I understood that that was my imposter syndrome or my inner critic, then that, helped to quiet that a little bit. But I also had to take courageous steps before I was feeling confident. And so I went through a period of time where my fear felt like sweating and getting overheated, like I could turn red. And I sat with a pan of ice under my desk when I was doing presentations or when I was starting out, with coaching and having, some important meetings to keep myself cool. So I was taking courageous action, even though I was feeling terrible. I wasn't feeling courageous at all. But then the more I coached or the more I presented or the more I taught in certain spaces, the more confident I became. And so I didn't need my ice bath. I wasn't overheating, right? So my confidence level was growing because I had taken those first courageous steps. So what is it that you need to do? I don't know how many of you are familiar with Mel Robbins. She has a podcast and several books, and she talks about her fear of public speaking. And she's a well-known public speaker now, and she's very fair. And so her experience is a little bit like mine, where she said her face would get bright red and her neck would just start itching so much that she would wear a turtleneck every time. And she would just, no matter what season, and she would just go out there and she would do it. And so she would take those steps in order to gain the skill and the capacity, and then her nervous system would begin to calm down as a result of that. So the other piece then is not waiting for the confidence. Know that confidence is something that we build over time. And I would love to have a conversation with people and talk about, your questions, some of your own experiences. And if we could just see everybody again, then I, feel like I could connect with you a little bit more. If you're open to turning on your camera, that's great. But I wanted to just hit some of these main points, knowing that we would engage a little bit more deeply here in our conversation. So what questions do you have? What experiences would you like to share, if you're comfortable sharing them in front of the group of your peers? Maybe that's scary.
I have for me, I would say my imposter syndrome hits hardest like in the big life changes, and that seems when I'm most unstable in in my confidence, I guess. And I'm like, does that ease up? I know this, it may sound silly, but I'm like, I think I felt really confident, and then I became a mom, and that shift was like back to square one again, like trying to figure it out again.
Sadly, no. Let's be honest. I don't think that it goes away, because every time we up level in our lives, the imposter syndrome is with us. The inner critic is with us, because we're trying something else that we've never done before. So we may have more familiarity with that voice and what our experience has been like with our nervous system and the way it shows up. But every new challenge, we're kind of starting from zero in terms of the confidence, but we're never starting from scratch. If you're 30, you have 30 years of experience. If you're 40, you have 40 years of experience. So you're never starting without knowing the, the lessons that you've learned over time. And so that's another important strategy that I find works really well for my clients, which is to mark their milestones and really remember what you have accomplished. Because so many of us, especially high achievers, move from one accomplishment to the next without thinking about what we did well. And in fact, we maybe only fixate on what we should have done better. I have a client who she was engaging in a big video process to create, some curriculum through Teachable, and it was expensive. And she hired a videographer, and, she'd done all this research, and it was really a big project, and she was petrified. Now she has a PhD herself. She's a business owner. And we talked about other times when she felt really afraid. And not that it was successful, but how she got through the process, right? Like what worked for her. And she couldn't remember. And all of a sudden, I saw her face just drop, and she just got really pale. And I said, what happened? What did you remember? She's like, I forgot that I ran this $300,000 grant at Harvard that was really successful. And then I gave this big presentation to an auditorium full of people. It's like, oh, okay. Like, all right. So that was probably challenging. And then she's like, I'm so mad at myself that I forgot that I did this. And she didn't actually forget, but the point was she hadn't marked that milestone to really remind herself that, yes, she's been frightened and she persisted, and this is what worked for her, and this is what fear felt like, this is what success felt like, so that she could use that moving forward. It's just this collection of evidence that she has of her own life that's going to be the thing that's going to help her, because evidence of my successes, that won't help her. It's her own evidence that's going to help her moving forward. So I would say, Michelle, no, it doesn't go away. And whenever you up level, everything else comes right along with it, but you gain competence in dealing with all of it. So you have lessons to fall back on. Yeah. Who else has it?
I just want to share one, like what I am currently going through. So I am trying to pivot my career into something else. I have like a lot of work experience, but not necessarily in the particular area that I am trying to pivot into. So the first thing that comes into my mind, like how, like, am I good enough for this particular skill or for this particular role that I'm trying to achieve? And what are my transferable skills that I can like portray to pivot into the new role, you know? Yeah.
And so what's your question, or what is your experience with you know, trying to manage the imposter syndrome?
So I think I really took my time to think about stories that and my experiences actually. So make up those stories which are focusing towards those roles. Like any project I have done, those are not one dimensional for sure, right? So I really take my time and think about, okay, in that particular area, how did I manage, you know, and try to pivot my stories like that. So that's something that that kind of worked till date. But other than that, like what other transferable skills that I can use to find, like, to pivot into my career?
You know, this is a really common conversation I find that I'm having with people these days about switching careers, thinking about their skills, how do they network, how do they market themselves, and some of those struggles. And, you know, there are statistics that suggest that women will only apply for jobs if they meet, you know, like 70% of the criteria, you know, or more, right? They have to be much higher. And there are other people who will apply if they've met only 30 or 40. And so we hold ourselves to a really high standard. And I believe a lot of the times that's because we've been evaluated based on our competence and our skills, whereas we see our male counterparts often being evaluated on their potential. And so we really fixate then on the skills, because that's what we've, you know, been taught, right? That's what our work experience has been about. And it's about skills. It's also about potential. So there are often biases in the workplace that are very real. And so I want to make sure that, you know, this doesn't come across as dismissing anyone's experience with imposter syndrome, because it is real, but it is also systemic too, right? So it's ours to carry and work on whatever we're experiencing. And then there are structural issues that we, you know, have to kind of be a part of in some way, or work for with other people if we can be an ally to them. But yes, this job change and career change is very common. And I think that right now, this is a time where we see women taking more leadership positions. I think that we're in such a time of change that people are recreating themselves in very different ways. And I think that I'm always telling my clients, let's go right now. Let's do this right now. Because if we wait, we're going to recreate that old norm. And these systems are just going to simply get a facelift, but we're going to see the same thing happening over again. But because we're still in so many transitions, this is a really important time for us to make some shifts. And I think it can be an opportunity, even though it's very scary and people, you know, have real material questions and concerns for themselves. There's so much fluctuation though, that there's time for us to try something different. All right, let's see. Sumaya? You have your hand up? Sumaya.
Yeah. So I guess I have one comment and then 2 questions. The first comment is to your point earlier around men also feeling imposter syndrome. I wouldn't have believed you unless I had heard it myself from one of our really senior male executives who happens to be a white male as well. He had mentioned how earlier in his career, he definitely had imposter syndrome. So I was shocked, when you look at this person, he's quite accomplished and literally made my jaw drop. So I definitely agree that it's, everybody feels it. It's just a question of, and to varying degrees, and some are pretty good at hiding it. The first question I have is just around this system of, the systems that exist, what sort of things can we do if we notice that there is not necessarily a culture that probably makes imposter syndrome worse. Then related to that, when we notice individuals who we feel have a lot of great potential, what can we do to help them see that what they're experiencing is imposter syndrome? And there's one person in particular that I'm thinking about. I have a friend who's quite talented, yet kind of freezes whenever she kind of experiences imposter syndrome. So wondering, what can I do to help her? So
yes, those are great questions. Thank you. I'll take them in reverse. I just read an article recently about the importance of mentoring. And I think that for many women in the workplace, we want to have other women as mentors, right? Or we want to mentor another generation. And this article pointed out the importance of having multiple mentors so that you're getting multiple perspectives, and so that you would have somebody who fits more of the mainstream within the culture of the organization, as well as somebody who is more on the perimeter, right, and has maybe a newer perspective. So to have somebody who has seniority and somebody who's newer, so that they're really able to understand a lot of different points of view, right? And how to engage. So what has worked strategically for different people in the workplace so that they can pick and choose and know that there's more than one way for that to happen. And then in terms of the system, well, and I'll also say this too, that freeze response, that's fear-based. And it's a nervous system response oftentimes. And, I think that it's important to acknowledge that is a real fear. And when we call something imposter syndrome and it seems very just cliche, I think that we can dismiss the real fear that people have. And some of us were taught not to be our full selves, that it's not safe. And that's true, right? That it's not safe to always be our full selves in certain spaces. And that can be exacerbated, then too, right? That can create this feeling of a lack of safety. So when I see a woman out there excelling, I often think to myself, she has a community around her. And so to have somebody like you who wants to help her and who wants to help her understand how to take that courageous action, like what we just said, it's really about, okay, so what's feasible though? Because if you push too far and you try to not even acknowledge what your body's telling you, when your body's like, I literally can't do it right now, that could make it worse for that person. So really, they have to figure out what is fear that they can manage to take this courageous action and what is too much. And so what are the smaller steps that they can take? But it's always about action. I think action helps us break through fear, and we can break it down into the smallest steps. And that's then something we can mark to say, okay, you did it though. You did this thing. So there's a little more evidence that you can do it, and have the accountability and take it very seriously with somebody else. I think that's also very key, because otherwise we're believing our own narratives, which are, I can't do it. There's no way, but that's not actually true. It's just, we need a little bit of help and accountability. In terms of the systems that exist, we're in an interesting time in terms of work culture. The funding and defunding of DEIB initiatives, you know, why we engage in them, if it's performative or if it's going to be a long-term real solution. And so it's really, you know, the individual culture, but there are really specific actions though that can be taken in terms of, you know, annual audits, equal access to professional development, for example, having those transparent conversations about wages, looking at who's in the room, who's, you know, got the power in that situation and how diverse is that, and figuring out if that's the conversation that can be had from the ground up or the top down or the both, and does it go through human resources? I mean, it's very different for each organization, and then some places are unionized. But Ruchika Tulshan and Jody Embury have another article in Harvard Business Review that actually lays out some very specific steps. So I would highly recommend that you go check that out, and it's available for free online. And then your first comment, yes. So yes, I know it can be very surprising about, you know, people experiencing imposter syndrome, but that was the initial point though of that article, Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome, because it's saying that we have created imposter syndrome as almost a stereotype that looks only a specific way, right? And so then what's not happening is we're not helping men who experience imposter syndrome, right? And we think, oh, it's only women that have imposter syndrome. So we're kind of pointing a finger at women, saying there's something wrong with you just inherently, which is a problem. So it's kind of breaking that down all the way around and being able to have these conversations that we all experience fear. It's not always imposter syndrome. And, you know, not every institution is friendly or has a healthy working environment. And that's why a lot of people experience imposter syndrome.
Thank you.
Everyone's moving, so I'm trying to find, I saw a hand. Erin, yes, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been great. My company is shifting gears a little bit. And so we used to be really focused on male advocacy for her. And this year we are shifting to be more so how can she advocate for herself? That's kind of the theme. And so I think the building blocks of that is confidence, right? I love the collection of evidence piece you mentioned earlier, but I would love your perspective on how can she advocate for herself, especially in maybe a difficult environment or a stressful environment.
It's a both and. I think to think that people are going to be able to advocate for themselves and be heard without the support of other people and allies it can be dangerous depending on the situation and depending on the person, right? Because the goal for advocating for yourself is, well, you tell me, what's the goal of advocating for herself?
I think the perspective and the rationale behind the potential shift is, for a while we were focused on male advocacy, which is important and necessary, but the debate came up is that, are we dependent upon that only, versus do you have confidence in yourself to stay in a room, the accomplishments you've had for yourself, right? And advocate for another female or a peer or someone else. And so it's really the dependency piece that we're trying to overcome, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So the paternalism, and yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's a really good question. I was talking with somebody the other day who said, don't tell me how to be empowered. I'm empowered. I just need you to get out of the way. I was like, oh yeah, that's good. Because sometimes there just are obstacles. I can advocate for myself all day long, but if people who have power to actually move those obstacles aren't going to do anything, then I'm going to be hitting my head against it. I'm going to be, walking into it over and over again. And that's going to lead to probably burnout. It's going to lead to me feeling a lot less empowered, right? So, yes, I believe that we can advocate for one another, but it has to be an ally. I mean, you're not going to just go ask anybody to help you, right? I mean, I think we have to be really strategic about that. You're not going to ask any woman to help you just because she's a woman, and you're not going to avoid asking any man to help you just because he's a man. You have to be really strategic about what role do they play, what power do they have, what part of the organization are they in? What are they in charge of? You know, I mean, there's so many other questions. And are they like-minded? Are they wanting to diversify leadership, for example? Are they wanting to make a change? And so I think that dependencies, yeah, I don't think that's the same thing as allied behavior. That's what I would say. So to be an ally is really different than to try to do it for somebody. What do you think about that, Erin?
No, I think it's fair and it makes sense. You know, if you keep hitting your head, it's frustrating and someone needs to help like break through, right? If they're on the other side of it. I don't know. I just think I don't want to feel dependent.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's,
mm-hmm.
yeah. So that's the debate that we're trying to help others, you know, not feel that way as well and feel more confident. So I appreciate it.
Yeah. There are also studies out there that talk about the bottom line, you know, the financial reason for, say, DEIB initiatives, right? But there's also a human reason, and now we're seeing them really cross over the past 2 and 3 years. People are talking about leaving their workplaces because they don't feel respected. They're leaving the workplaces for these other kinds of reasons, right? Like lack of support, lack of financial support. So now what we're seeing is that it makes good business sense to be a more equitable workplace. And so, you know, I'm glad to see that, you know, is being borne out in the research, but how do we do it? It depends on the culture of the institution. Yeah.
Michelle, I just wanted to give a quick, you know, just example here as I relate to your, you know, discussion here. Certainly one aspect is, you know, maybe we are feeling more like we're becoming dependent. On the other hand, the office culture is such, we're always dependent on each other. I mean, without that support, nothing happens. I personally experienced some of these difficulties for very long. And it was a very interesting learning for me because I think as women, we try to do things all ourselves. I think we take some pride on that. You know, we don't ask enough help actually. But at the end of the day, what we learn is that we really need that help. You know, we need people empowering us, and it is, you know, that help actually empowers us to make decisions, to remove obstacles, to make progresses. And without that, it is really super challenging. And, you know, it certainly feels, you know, on the other hand, you feel like you can't really achieve what you're trying to achieve. You can't get enough support. And it becomes really such a big difficulty. And with all the things that you're saying, you know, you find yourself trying to justify again and validate and show everyone that you can achieve without the support, but really nothing happens without that support. So, you know, I sort of relate to that, just, you know, going through some similar examples at workplace. It's really such a difficult and tough situation to be. So we certainly need that support from, you know, people at power in order to be able to make sure that we can feel empowered to turn things around, if you will.
Your comment, thank you for that, reminds me of some of the profiles that we see about imposter syndrome. You know, that there's the perfectionist model of imposter syndrome, that there's that individualist model, there's that superhuman model. And I think that people who are socialized as females in this country specifically is what I'm thinking of, but in other places too, are taught that we need to be able to do it all. right? That if we're going to, that, you know, there's the second shift labor that we're still seeing in the domestic sphere. It's the emotional labor that we're seeing transfer them back over into the work sphere, and that we won't let any ball drop. And yet we go last then, right? And we are taking care of ourselves last, which is when the burnout happens. And so that sort of superhuman individualistic piece can really lead to burnout very quickly and feelings of disempowerment. And yet I advocate for women to try to develop their own self-trust, right? And to be able to make a plan for themselves. But I often think that that plan probably involves other people, especially if it's in the workplace, so that you can make a strategy to, you know, write an open letter, or to have a meeting, or to make a strategy that you know, would bring, right, to somebody else to take a look at. Yeah, thank you.
Well, it was such an engaging discussion, Dr. Morkert. I mean, so many actionable takeaways for us, right? I just wish we had more time, you know, so that yeah, it's already like, yeah, we are at time. Yeah, but I would like to continue the discussion, and I will collect any questions if anyone you have, and I can definitely send it to Dr. Morkert and get your perspective, right? So
Great.
yeah, I really thank you for your time today. And before we just go, can we just take a picture for our social media? And whoever is off camera, if you can just turn on your camera for just a second. Okay, on 3. 1, 2, 3.
Did you get it?
1 second. Yep.
And I will also say that I'll just send this to you, Priyanka, because you have the list of everyone who is here. I'll send this giveaway that I have. It's about how to quiet the inner critic, or partner with the inner critic, and it reviews a lot of what we talked about tonight. So it's not brand new, but it would be nice to have, just, you know, for you to be able to review. You can find out more on my website too, because I have a blog there that I keep, and a newsletter. So there's a lot of just free resources that I believe in, you know, sharing. And so you're welcome to any of those too. So please join me, you know, in the conversation. And if you have questions, feel free to email, because I would love to keep the conversation going. It's how we make change, one conversation at a time.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. And sorry, I just have a quick question for you, Michelle. So while you were presenting, I just thought, like, this fear, I'm not necessarily saying the imposter syndrome, but this fear or doubtful thoughts, do they have any actual benefit? Like little bit of, because at the end of the day, if I am having that fear, I will strive my level best to give my 200%, or for a quality deliverable, right? So does it have any benefit?
One of the ways I look at this is that it shows how much I care, honestly, because it's somehow connecting to my values, that I care about my job. I care about, you know, the particular impact. I care about I'll take me. I care about my research. I want to be methodical with my research. I never want to, you know, cast somebody in the wrong light. I want to make sure I've got my sources lined up, because I care. So when I can ask myself how much of that fear is connected to my values, I can understand what part makes sense. And then it helps me to differentiate between the part that makes sense and the part that's actually my inner critic that's like, what the hell are you doing? Don't publish that, you know, don't do that. Nobody cares about that, right? So I think it's mixed up, but there is a line, and keeping part of it can be very beneficial to us. And also it does keep us safe. I mean, there's a lot of reason for it. It's evolutionary.
That makes sense.
Yeah. I've loved trying to keep up with the chat, but it's very challenging for me because I'm like listening to all of you. Oh my God, Michelle, yes. So sometimes fear and excitement feel very similar. And so I've noticed with myself, because I've been someone who has learned how to manage my own fear, just like historically, you know, my lifetime over fear. And now I had to learn that I would feel nervous and have that same desire to numb out. Like, oh my God, I'm just gonna go watch Netflix and like have a glass of wine. But I'm happy, right? But it felt the same. It had like a very similar feeling to the nervousness, and it was confusing and I didn't know what to do with it. And so there were times I'm like, I don't know what's happening. I just need to numb out and stop this. And then I began to realize exactly what you just put in the chat. So our bodies tell us, and we have to try to interpret what the meaning is, so that we can know what actions to take that will help us move forward toward our goals.
Well, I can't imagine how, like, I speaking and keeping up with the chat, but I did want to make sure you saw there was a lot of gratitude. I know we're over time, but we did have people coming on and just saying thank you so much again. It's from the bottom of our heart. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Oh, well, I was happy to be here. I'd be happy to come back another time, you know, to have this conversation, keep it going, or to pick some part of it up. If you want to do a deeper dive into one area, I'd be happy to do that. But check out those resources that I mentioned. They're very helpful and they're free and available to you online.
That sounds wonderful.
Right.
Well, thank you. We are 6 minutes over, so sorry for the overtime, but yeah, I wanted to be respectful to everyone's time. So yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Morkert. I mean, this was incredible, and thank you, Michelle, as well, for introducing me to Dr. Morkert. So
yeah, thank you. Have a great night, everybody. Thank you, and happy Women's History Month.
Same to you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.